Good evening, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. We are learning tonight Maseches Eruvin Daf Tes, and we're starting on the bottom of Daf Ches and Beis, 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Yesterday, toward the end of the day, we had a conversation about whether or not it's permissible to use the space under a koreh. It's important to start with that because, as we'll see, it's going to play out momentarily. But in that conversation, what we saw is that there's a machlokes amoraim as to whether or not one is allowed to use the space that's under a koreh. And with that frame, we're going to jump right in. And the Gemara starts 4 lines from the bottom of Ches and Beis and says as follows: Amar Rav Chizda hakol modim bevein lechayayim she'aser, that between lechis, one is not allowed to use that space. To be clear, it doesn't really mean only between lechis. Rashi here points this out, that it means to use the space near a lechi. That is considered to be potentially problematic. And that is the sheet of Rav Chizda, bottom of Ches and Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Ba'minei Rami bar Chama me Rav Chizda. I have a question for you. And he asks as follows: Noat shtei yisedos v'shnei kosle mavui mibachutz v'hiniach kore al gabein mahu. I'd like you to imagine that you're about to walk into a mavui. You're about to walk into an alleyway. But before you get into the space of the alleyway, there are 2 poles that are sticking out of the mavui from each wall with a bar across the top. So it's not like the core is on top of the walls of the mavui. There are pegs sticking out of the mavui facing you as you walk in, and it's resting on top of that. So that's the case here of Noat Shtei Yasedos. Amar Le, in such a case, L'divrei hamatir asur, L'divrei ha'oser mutter. This is a very interesting play on language. And it's playing off of the machlokes that we saw yesterday, the one that I started with, as I referenced in the beginning, in regards to using the space of a koreh. And what we're saying here is that he who says that it's permissible to use who says it's permissible to be under a koreh would say that this type of koreh is forbidden, and the one who, in the previous case, who said that it was usher to use the koreh, in this case, would say it's permissible. And the reason why there's a distinction is because this koreh, as I described, is not hanging over the walls of the mavui itself, but are rather hanging over pegs that extend from the mavui outward into the Rishus Harabim. So they're different. So each shita has their opinions flip-flop in this case. Rava, on the other hand, argues and says, Rava Amar L'divrei ha'oser nani oser. He holds that no, everybody seems to hold that in this strange case of a koreh, which is hanging on pegs, which is over pegs, but not over the mavui, hanging on pegs that extend out of the mavui into the Rishus Harabim. So he would be of the opinion that it's also usher to use that space under there. So ask the Gemara, and then the Gemara says a critical line, one that is extremely halacha l'maisa. Why is it that Rava says that it's usher, even according to the one who said it was usher in the case of koreh we learned yesterday? So says the Gemara 5 words that really 6, I guess, that really shape a significant feature of Eruvin, and that is Ba'inan koreh al gabe mavui veleka. When we have a koreh, when we have that beam or that rope that's above us, it has to be directly on top of the mavui, and in this case, it doesn't exist because it was on pegs and it wasn't on the mavui. Now, you may have noticed, if you've ever looked at Eruvin before, that really the wires are, let's say that my hand here is a pole, and then there's a wire. So the wire is always wrapped around something on the top. It's not wrapped around the pole itself. It has to be al gabe mavui. And that is a very specialized and customized din that we need to make sure is the case. If ever anybody asks you to check an Eruv, that is one of the primary things that can go wrong in an Eruv, is that the rope is not directly above the pole that's holding it. This can happen, of course, with the tension on the screw or on the nail, whatever it may be. And that's based on this line of the Gemara, Ba'inan koreh al gabe mavui veleka. The Gemara asks a question. Rav Ada bar Masna l'Rava. Now the Meforshim here point out that this question isn't only against Rava, it's actually also against Rav Chizda, and this might be a challenge in the Girsa here, but the Gemara's question nevertheless is as follows: Haisa korasa meshucha o teluya. Let's say that you had a koreh, you had a beam that you're using as a matir to carry in a mavui, you're using it as that thing that's going to help you carry in a mavui. However, it's meshucha or teluya. We're going to read Rashi now, and then we'll reject this. Let's see what Rashi says. Rashi at the top of Daf Testament Aleph says, Dibra hamaschel meshucha, mashma rechoka hi minak salim. It seems, according to the word meshucha, that it's away from the mavui a little bit. It's not near the mavui walls. Next option, otluya, she'ein rosheha munachan al gabik salin, ela taluya be'avir. This type of mavui is actually, it doesn't reach the ends. Rashi here has a picture where the koreh it doesn't actually reach the mavui walls, and it's only held up by a pole in the middle. So this is what Rashi says. I'll just read the Rashi again from the beginning. Dibur hamaschil o tuluya she'ein rosheha munachan al gabe haksalim. The ends, the rosheha, the heads of the pieces of wood of the korah are not resting on the walls. Ela tuluya be'avir. It's actually short of each mavui wall, like this picture indicates. Shektsar mishtei ruchoseha. It's shorter than both sides of the mavui walls. And there's just a simple pole that's holding it up. Pesach mavui, at the opening of the mavui. And this is the drawing that we see, where the korah is at the entrance of the mavui, but not long enough to touch either of the walls. That's our havamina. The meshucha is a korah outside of our mavui, and this one is inside the mavui, but not wide enough to reach either wall of the mavui. So in this case, what is the din about both meshucha and tuluya? So it says the Gemara as follows. Top line, daf tesman aleph. Pachos mishlosha. If you have a distance that's less than 3 tfachim from the koreh to the walls of the mavui, either in the case of meshucha or tluya, so then ein tzarach lahavi koreh acheres, no problem at all. But if it's shlosha, if it is 3 or greater, then tzarach lahavi koreh acheres. Of course, the Tanna Kama here is employing the principle of lavud, that when we have something that's within 3 tfachim, we consider them to be somewhat connected. So that's what the Gemara here says in the name of the Tanna Kama. What we are about to learn is an excellent piece of general yeda, an excellent piece of general knowledge in regards to lavud. We are exposed to the idea, I'm sure we all know, that when it comes to lavud, that lavud is a din of 3 tfachim or less. Interestingly, we now see the shita of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who argues, Rashba gomer pachos me arba ein tzarach lahavi korah acheres. The world of lavud, according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, is when it's 4 tfachim or less than 4 tfachim, but not 3. 3 is only Tanna Kama. We paskin like the Tanna Kama, but Rav Shimon ben Gamliel has a real shita out there in the Tanaim that holds that lavud is a din in 4. So however that plays out over here is as follows. Arba'a, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel pachos me arba ein tzarach lahavi korah acheres, that if the korah, which is meshucha or tluya, either outside of the mavui, or as the picture indicates in Rashi, within the mavui but not reaching the walls, so then Rashbag is a little bit of a leniency, that as long as there's less than 4 tfachim between either of these mavuis and the walls, either of these korahs and the walls of the mavui, so then the din is you would not need another lechi. But arba, if it was 4 tzarach lahavi korah acheres. So says the Gemara, my lav meshucha mi bachutz v'tzluya mi bifnim. Doesn't the word meshucha mean outside, like top Rashi that we saw? That was our havamina within this source in the Tanaim, is that the concept of meshucha is a korah that's outside. And remember what we were talking about on the bottom of the previous page, where the pegs are, let's say, for example, that this is one of the mavui walls, right? This is a mavui wall from a side view. And there's a peg extending from here, and there's a korah resting on top of it. It's outside, it's meshucha. So where do you get away with this whole machlokas between the Amoraim on the bottom of Daf Ches and Beis with the case of not shtei yesedos in the walls of the mavui, where the korah is hanging outside the mavui on pegs? What are you talking about? That's the case of meshucha. So why would you say? That's what the Gemara asks here. My lav, 5th line, 6th line. My lav meshucha mi bachutz v'tzluya mi bifnim. In which case, who needs your machlokas? We have the shitas in the Tanaim about the case of meshucha. Says the Gemara, no, you're incorrect about what meshucha means. Idi v'idi mi bifnim. Really, both meshucha and tuluya, both of these types of korahs are within the walls, like the picture indicates, are within the walls of the mavui, and the case of meshucha is needed on the bottom of the previous page, which is why there's a machlokas there. But that's not meshucha. So let's see how the Gemara understands this new case. Lo, it is not meshucha that's external and tuluya that's internal. Idi v'idi mi bifnim, both are internal. Meshucha me ruach achas, v'tluya mishtei ruchos. Meshucha is when the korah is long enough to rest on one wall, but not the second wall. And tuluya is when it's mishtei ruchos, it's not touching any of the walls. And what was our concern about these 2 different cases? Mahu detema, I might have thought as follows. Meruach achas amrinan lavud, mishtei ruchos lo amrinan lavud, kamash malan. How many times are we allowed to employ the halacha l'mosh misinai of lavud in one circumstance? Once or twice or 3 times? Is there a maximum? So we had a havamina here that maybe we were only allowed to employ lavud once. And therefore, in the case of meshucha, where the korah was resting on one side of the wall, but it didn't reach the other one, fine, I understand that case because I'm only employing lavud one time on the shorter side of the korah where it doesn't reach the mavui. But what if the case was tluya? What if the case was where the korah doesn't reach either wall of the mavui? It's within lavud on both sides. Are we allowed to use lavud twice? Havamina, you're not allowed. Kamash Malan, yes, we are allowed to employ lavud twice within the same exact halachic scenario. Multiple times is permissible. Rav Ashi gives a different answer to this question as to why we need this case. Rav Ashi Amar Meshucha vehi tluya. No, Meshucha is a case of tluya. The two terms are meant to shape out one case. Vehechidami, what is that case? It's our case that we saw, a little bit of the case that we saw on the bottom with a slight modification. This will, you'll benefit from the picture here called Mavui de Rav Ashi, which we'll see in Rashi. Vehechidami, what is the case according to Rav Ashi? Here's what the Gemara says. Kigon shenat shtei yesedos akumos. You have two pegs that are angled. Al shnei kosle mavui she'ein begovhan gimel. So it's extending. Let's say that this is this side wall. I don't know what side of the screen you're seeing over there. And then this is wall number one. So there's a peg that comes up on an angle like this, kore, and then on the other wall, the peg comes back down on an angle. So that's the case here. Again, mavui de Rav Ashi, as Rashi refers to it here. And that's what Rav Ashi says is going on here. Ve'ein, let's just read this case again. Two angled pegs, al shnei kosle mavui, that are rooted, they're screwed into the walls of the mavui. She'ein begovhan gimel. There is no height of 3 from the wall of the mavui to the koreh. Ve'ein ba'akmi musan gimel, and the angle, the hypotenuse of the actual angle of that peg is also not 3 tvachim. Ma'u detema o lavud amrinan o chavut amrinan. I might have had a havamina that maybe I can only use lavud, but I can't doubly use lavud and chavut. Chavut is a different type of din. Lavud makes it be that there's some type of connection. Chavut is where we halachically lower something. They're very similar. There are shitas in the achronim. Excuse me. There are shitas in the achronim that try to make the distinctions between them. But for our purposes, we're just going to ask the simple question of whether or not we can employ both of them at once. One is to make the connection, which is lavud, and the second is chavut, which technically lowers it down. Ma'u detema, what might I have thought? Oh, lavud amrina no chavut amrina. I can only employ one of these halachic principles. Lavud v'chavud lo amrinan kamash malan. So Rav Ashi takes a variation on the initial theme of whether or not you can use lavud twice within one scenario. Here we ask a similar question of whether or not you can use lavud and chavut in one scenario, and in both cases we paskin the kula. Rav Yochanan was giving shir, and there was someone in his shir who quoted a brisa. Tani, here's the brisa that was taught. The Tani Rav Zakkai. Rav Zakkai was sitting in the shir, and he quotes as follows. Tani Rav Zakkai kamed to Rav Yochanan. He said in Rav Yochanan's shir, Bein lechayayim v'tachas hakora nidon kekarmelis. There are two cases where we treat a certain location like a karmelis. As we all know, a karmelis is a rabbinically injuncted upon space where you're not allowed to carry there. You're not allowed to carry in that space. It's a karmelis. Now, this source in the Tanaim that Rav Zakkai quoted to Rav Yochanan said that there were two cases where something's treated like a karmelis. One is when you're near a lechi, and the other is where you're under a koreh. Amar lei pok tani livra. This is how you got kicked out of shir when you were a kid in Rav Yochanan's land. If you were to quote a brisa that he didn't agree with, pok tani livra, please go outside of the room. I can't handle you quoting this heretical information, totally incorrect. Now, we don't know what he said that was incorrect. That's subject to a machlokas Abai v'Rava that we're going to see right now. But there were two possible things that he said wrong. And Rav Yochanan either disagreed with one or he disagreed with both. There only are two options. So let's see what happened here. Amar Abaye mistabra milsa de Rav Yochanan. Maybe what Rav Yochanan, where he held on his own that something was not a karmelis, was tachas akora. Aval bein lechayayin aser. Abaye wants to recommend that Rav Zakkai was quoting a brisa correctly. That near a lechi, the din is that it's taka like a karmelis, but under a koreh, Rav Yochanan would be matir. The Rava Amar, nope. Rava says he doesn't only argue on the koreh. Rava Amar, bein lechayayim nami muter. Rava says that Rav Yochanan was pushing back on Rav Zakkai's brisa on both counts, both by the lechi and the koreh. So now we have three different shitas. We have shita number one, which was the initial presentation of Rav Zakkai, that in near a lechi and under a koreh, we treat it like a karmelis. Abaye says nothing doing. Abaye says no, it's only one. Rav Yochanan is of the opinion that near a lechi is problematic, but under a koreh is fine. And Rava says both of them are fine. And these are all shitas in the Amoraim. So we have three shitas that we have to try and understand. But really what's happening is that Abaye and Rava are trying to get in the head of Rav Yochanan. They're trying to figure out what he was thinking. So let's see how the Gemara explains itself. Amar Rava, mino aminola, how do I know what I'm saying is true? Because the Chiyasa Rav Dimi, Amar Rav Yochanan, makom she'ein bo arba al arba, if there's a place that is not 4x4, namely a carmelis, which is what we're talking about here, a space that's theoretically a carmelis at least, here we're actually going to find out it's a makom p'tur. What do we see? Muter livnei rishus harabim livnei rishus hayachid l'katef alav. It's permissible for people from the public and from the private to use that space to adjust a package that's on their shoulder. Now, this concept of l'katef alav we learned in Maseches Shabbos a Masechta ago, where we learned that one is allowed to stop walking to kind of use a wall or use something that's near you to kind of help readjust a package on your back, on your head, on your shoulder, whatever the case is. So that's what the katef alav is. So what do we see from Rabbi Yochanan? This particular description of less than dalet al dalet and mutter l'katef alav sounds just like a lechi and under a korah. What's wrong with those spaces? Seemingly, Rabbi Yochanan would be of the opinion that these things are mutter, just like Rava wanted to say that Rabbi Yochanan disagreed with Rav Zakkai doubly. He disagreed in regards to a lechi and in regards to a korah, that Rav Zakkai held that both would be a carmelis, and here we see that that's not the case. Here we see that we're talking about a case where one is allowed to use that space where it's less than dalet al dalet. Ubilvad shelo yachlifu, as long as you don't use it in some type of ramaus fashion, where it might become clear that the reason why you're using it is just to get from a rishus hayachid to a rishus harabin. So we have to try and make sure that we don't do this intentionally. But if the reason why you're going into this makom p'tur, even though you will be going in between a rishus harabin and a rishus hayachid, as long as it's not kedei lahachlifu, that you're trying to change over spaces, because that it's just you're just using a loophole. So that's Rava's proof. The Abaye. How does Abaye argue with this? Abaye says, no, that's not a good Mari Makom, Rava, to teach your Shita, because when is that din true? Hasan B'Gavosh Shlosha. That's true when there's something identifiable about those spaces, when there's 3 tfachim off the ground, a small little mound, a stubble, whatever it is. But in the case of the Koren, in the case of the Lechi, there is no 3 tfachim off the ground, says Abaye. So Rava, your argument is not good. Amar Abaye, what about me? What about my Shita that says that I still hold that Rava is of the opinion, that Rav Yochanan, is of the opinion that near Lechi is still Aser? Says the Gemara, Aminala, Da'amar Rabbi Chama Bar Guria Amar Rab. Tocha Pesach, Rashi here points out this is a structure that's just outside of a mavui. Tzarech lechi acher lehatira. That even though there are lechis in this structure, you're not allowed to be there. You need another lechi, implying that you're not allowed to be near those lechis. The chitema, the ispei dalet al dalet. If you want to argue that maybe that space that we're talking about, this Pesach that's outside the mavui, is dalet al dalet, in which case it's its own rishus. In which case you can't learn anything out about whether or not it's mutter to use a lechi because it's its own rishus. So the question just kind of gets greater and larger than the one we're dealing with. It can't be that. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava Amar Rav Tocha Pesach Afal Pi She'ein Bo Dalet Al Dalet Tzarech Lechi Acher La'atira, because Rav explicitly stipulated the case where it's less than Dalet Al Dalet. So therefore, we see that that Rav Yochanan is of the opinion. It doesn't say Rav Yochanan's name, but we just assume that Rav Yochanan learned everything from Rav, which is definitely in a great part true. So the Gemara makes that assumption without actually writing that that's the case. Nevertheless, what we see here is that it's Tzarech Lechi Acher Lehatiro. The Rava, how do you look at that source? Rava, Abaye just gave you a pretty good Mari Malcolm. How are you going to answer that? Rava answers with a controversial answer. He says, Hasam de Pasuach leKarmelis. No, that case was when what was outside the mavoi wasn't a rishus harabim, but was a carmelis. In that case, we would taka say that a lechi is problematic, but otherwise, Rabbi says, Rav Yochanan would say that it's perfectly mutter against Rav Zakkai on both counts, just like Rabbi wanted to say before. So says the Gemara, wait a minute. What you're saying is that if the space outside of the mavoi is the space outside of a mavoi is a carmelis, that's when you're not allowed to sit near a lechi? Aval, says the Gemara, L'shus harabim mai shari. You're going to say that if the space outside of a mavui is a Rishus harabim, that you're allowed to use the lechi? That's like mind-blowing. Like the space that's outside of the lechi, when outside of a mavui that's a Rishus harabim, is doraisa. And a carmelis outside of a lechi, outside of the mavui, is derabana. And says the Gemara, this rhetorical question, Yitziva be'ara v'giyora b'shmei shemaya. The noble people, they're the ones that are on the ground. And the rookie, the giyora, the new one, they're up b'shmei shemaya with a Karesh Baruch. You got everything backwards. Why aren't you concerned about Rishus Harabim? Rishus Harabim is Daraisa. Says the Gemara, I taka do hold that way. And in fact, it's true. Matzah min esmino v'neiyor. These two things blend together because they're the same. What's the same? Remember the line that Rav Zakkai presented to Rav Yochanan that it's a carmelis? It's exactly what's happening here. Near the lechi is considered a carmelis. And if Rava says the space outside of the mavui is also a carmelis, it's min b'mino. It's two things of the same type. It's, as my father, my chemistry teacher taught me years ago, like dissolves like. You have a water base, it'll dissolve in a water base. You have an oil base, it'll dissolve in an oil base. They don't usually mix well oil to water. Well, I have two carmelios here. I have the carmelis that's next to the lechi, and I have the carmelis that's outside. So they blend to each other, and therefore it's prohibited. But he disagrees with Abai fundamentally and says that really what Rav Yochanan meant was that both of Rav Zakkai's comments from that brisa were wrong. That both under a koreh and near a lechi are both permissible. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua. We're about 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Tes Amud Aleph, and I don't have too much percentage on my computer left, so we're going to have to keep going here. Amar le Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua the Rava ve'ad lo tizbra debein lechayayim aser. Rava, you wanted to recommend within the world of Rav Yochanan that near lechi is permissible, but you don't hold that way. How can that be? Ad lo tizbra debein lechayayim aser. You don't hold that near lechi is aser to be like a carmelist. You have to hold that way. Why? Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rav Yochanan, in the name of Rav Yochanan, Mavui shiratzcho belechayayin pachos midalid. Let's say that you have, and the picture here in the Gemara indicates as much. You have a mavui, and on the left side or on the right side of the mavui, either side, you have lechi after lechi. Let's look at the spacing here. Pachos midalid, and the spacing is a little bit less than 4 tefach between each lechi. How does that then work according to the Tanaim? Banu lemachlokes Rashbag v'Rabbanan. Le Rashbag, according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, remember from the top of the blot, we learned that lavud is dalet amos, dalet tfachim, according to the shita of Rashbag. Rashbag de Amar Amrinan lavud, he says that 4 tfachim is lavud. Then mishtamesh al chudo hapnimi shel lechi hapnimi. Then he says that you're allowed to consider all the space 1 unit up until the first part of the last lechi. Let's say there's 4 or 5 deep, however many there are, it's all considered one space because of lavud. Masha ein kain, 4 or 5 lines from the bottom, the Rabbanon de Amre lo amrin and lavud. In this case, where they can't employ lavud because the Rabbanon hold that lavud is only gimel tfachim, and this is closer to dalet tfachim. So then mishtamesh al chudo hapnimi shel chitzon. Then the lechi is only usable up until the very last part of the very last part of the very first lechi. So what do we see according to both of them? Aval bein lechayayin. But had it been that there was a gap larger than that, what would we have said? To kulei alma aser, both according to Rashbag and according to the Rabbanan, we would have had a problem of bein lechayayin aser. So then what I don't understand here, says the Gemara, is Rava, how can you be of the opinion in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that he held that bein lechayayin was mutter? That doesn't work. Rav Yochanan himself didn't allow that. So says the Gemara, the Rava, how would he explain? That case of the mavui, the one pictured here in the Gemara with the multiple lechis, one after the other, that's also where the outside of the mavui was a carmelis. Aval, Rishus Harabim, my shari. Would you argue that the outside of a mavui that's a Rishus Harabim would be permissible? Says the Gemara, yes, I would. But before we get to the answer, we'll say the same rhetorical line as we did before. The noblemen are on the ground, and the newbie is up in Shamayim with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You got it all backwards. Says Gemara in Matzamin V'mino B'neir. Yes, it is in fact the case that because we assume that the outside is a carmelis, it then blends inward for that to be a carmelis as well. But yes, Rabbi Yochanan would still be of the opinion that under normal circumstances, where the outside of the mavui is Rishus Harabim, that it would then be permissible to be near a lechi. Turning to the top of Daf Tes Amud Beis, we're only going to be going about 2/3 of the way down, and then we will call it a night. So let's get started on the rest of this sugya. Rav Ashi Amar. Rav Ashi says, I'm going to give you a slightly different case scenario to help us navigate this sugya. We already saw the first answer. Amar kigon shiratzvu b'lechayayin pachos mi'arba b'meshech arba amos. Here, this is a little bit different. It's an added twist, b'meshech arba amos. So you have lechis, each of which are less than 4 tfachim apart, but it goes on for 4 amos. So lechi after lechi after lechi, less than 4, let's say 3.5 by 3.5, keep going one after the other until you get to the point of 4 amos. Le Reb Shimon ben Gamliel de Amar Amrinan lavud. If you have lavud after lavud after lavud up to 4 amos, then you have a new reshus. You just created a new space. Lechi after lechi, those pieces of wood connect. you're allowed to use a sukkah like that. If you have lateral slats, one on top of the other, up to 10 tefachim by your sukkah, that counts as a wall because of lavud. So if I have lechi after lechi after lechi, that also counts. And what if it goes for 4 amos? Then I have a new rishus, that's a mavui. And of course, tzarach lechi acher lahatiro. And the Rabbanan who say that lavud is only 3 tvachim and cannot employ lavud here because the gap between each of the lechis here is beyond 3 but less than 4. So then they have to say something else. Lo tzarach lechi acher lehatiro. So that's the approach of Rav Ashi in the source that we saw on the bottom of the page of the extra lechis. And now the Gemara adds in something that we spoke about a little bit before, and we're going to speak a little bit more about now as well, which is what if the lechi or the korah, for that matter, are seen differently from someone inside the mavui and outside? If a lechi or a korah is meant to be a reminder, a heker of what's going on, so then internally within the mavui, I need to be able to see what's going on. The fact that you can see it from the Rishus HaRabim doesn't mean that I should be able to carry inside, or does it? So let's see what the Gemara does with this. But according to Rabbi Gamliel, shouldn't this be a problem where maybe you'll see all the lechis from the outside, but from the inside, it's its own rishus. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on. It doesn't look like its own lechi. It looks like a new structure. So says the Gemara, Midi hutaima ela Rabbi Yochanan. This sounds like something that would be said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Haki asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Let's see what he said. Nira mi bachutz v'shava mi bifnim eino nidon mishum lechi. That when it is nira mi bachutz, if something is visible from the outside, but from the inside, the insider's perspective of a mavui, where it's shava mi bifnim, it all looks the same to me. I don't really see a lechi. So then eino nidon mishum lechi. Then Rabbi Yochanan would say that doesn't function as a lechi, and you're going to need another lechi to be matir. Itmar, let's see what the Amoraim say about this. What about the reverse case? What about nira mi bifnim? From the inside of the mavui, I can see the lechi and korah properly. I live in the mavui, I look up, I see my heker perfectly. But from the outside, it's kind of hidden where someone from the outside can't see the lechi. So does that work? That's a machlokes. Itmar nir mi bifnim v'shavim mi b'chutz nidon mishum lechi. I'm sorry, that's not a shaila. That's nidon mishum lechi. Everyone agrees that it counts as a lechi. Nir mi b'chutz v'shavim mi bifnim. But if from the outside it's visible and the inside it's not visible, then we see the machlokes that was mentioned earlier. Reb Shimon ben Rabbi, Chad Amar nidon mishum lechi v'chad Amar eno nidon mishum lechi. Each one holds differently. That one of them says that when it's shavim mi bifnim, that if I'm inside, then the lechi might look like it's right. If I'm inside, I don't see it, but from outside, the lechi looks like it's there. That is a machlokes. And the Gemara says that Rav Chia was on one side and Rav Shimon ben Rabbi was on the other, but we didn't know who said what. So says the Gemara, Tistayim, we could possibly conclude what Rav Chia held. Tistayim de Rav Chia hu to Omar nidon mishum lechi. Rav Chia was of the opinion that says that when the person from the outside can see the lechi, then it has a din of a lechi. How do we know this? Tani, because he taught it. Tani Reb Chia, kosel shetzido echad kanus michavero. Let's say that you have a mavui. Each of my arms is a wall of the mavui, and one is kanus. One is indented a little bit. The wall tapers a little bit on one side. That's this case here by Reb Chia, middle of the page, Daf Testament base. Tani Reb Chia, kosel shetzido echad kanus michavero, where one wall is tapered a little bit. Bein shenir mi bachutz v'shava mi bifnim. We see that Rav Chia was of the opinion that in either direction, whether or not the lechi was not visible inside but was visible outside, or the reverse, where it was not visible outside and was visible inside, in either way, he said it had the din of lechi. So that should work out. So it says the Gemara, Tistayim, it seems to be that makes perfect sense. The only problem is that Rav Chia is quoting a brisa. Rav Yochanan, Milo Shmi Aleha. Rav Yochanan didn't have the brisa. And we try not to give that answer on the Gemara. So what does it mean that Rav Yochanan didn't have the Gemara? So it says the Gemara, Velo Savarla, could be Rav Yochanan, Milo Shmi Aleha, Ela Shmi Ale Velo Savarla. Maybe he heard of it, but he disagreed with it. Rav Chia Namilo Savarla. But then if he didn't agree with it, then why did Rav Chia? How do you know how Rav Chia holds? Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Hi, my. What is your question? Bishlama Rav Yochanan lo savarla mishum hachi lo tanala. Rav Yochanan never taught it. It doesn't ever say Tani Rav Yochanan and then quote this whole brisa about the fact that it's nidon mishum lechi, whether or not you can see the lechi from inside or from outside. But we do see El Rav Chia Isa de lo savarla lamalei lemisna. We do have an explicit brisa that's quoted in the name of Rav Chia to say that one is in fact going to be nidon mishum lechi. You're allowed to carry in a mavui whether or not, whether you can, if you can see the mavui outside, if you can see the lechi, outside the mavui, and that's the sheet of Rav Chi, and the Gemara concludes here accordingly. So we'll stop here for tonight at Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna. We'll pick up tomorrow night in Yirtzeh Hashem with Daf Yud, and that's it for tonight. Wishing you all a beautiful night.